Okay, folks, I want to do a little bit of review here of some of the stuff we've already talked about and talk about multipliers again as well as aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay, because I know that some of you have probably not really thought about this a whole lot in the past couple of weeks, being spring break and all. So let us recall that we have a graph that looks a little something like this, where we have our GDP here on the x-axis, we have price level here on the y-axis. You have a downward sloping curve, which is aggregate demand, upward sloping curve, which is SRAS, short run aggregate supply. And then you have this vertical line here, which is long run aggregate supply, which intersects the x-axis at full employment output, which represents what the economy is capable of doing when it is at full employment. So if we are doing about as best as we can, we are going to be producing at that level of real GDP at this particular price level. Okay. Now, you may recall also that we can wind up having changes to this here graph. For example, let's say that we are going to hit a recession. All right, well, what happens in a recession? Let's see if I can change the line here a little bit. We'll just go with that. Okay, so let's turn that off. There we go. If we're in a recession, remember aggregate demand is equal to C plus IG plus G plus XN. So in a recession, you tend to have consumption going down, investment going down. As a result, aggregate demand goes down also and shifts to the left. So when aggregate demand decreases, the result is lower price levels and output falls. Okay, so lower output, we're producing less stuff at the same time as price levels have fallen, which is going to be deflation. Okay, now what happens if you're going to be a classical economist? What we do about this is nothing. Eventually, unemployment gets bad enough. Remember that wages and prices are sticky in the short run, and then eventually unemployment gets bad enough that employees will be willing to accept lower wages. And as that occurs, I'm a producer, I start to make more profit, and then SRAS would shift to the right. So, what did we need to do? Nothing. All right. But recall that if you are a Keynesian, that is not a good answer. What we need to do is something in the meantime. So, got the same graph again here. Price level, aggregate demand, SRAS. Or LRAS, full employment output. You need to practice drawing this graph. You're going to be required to do it and know how it operates. Even if you want to be doing the digital test, which will not require you to graph for the AP test, you really need to know how to operate this graph, though, because it will give you answers. Okay, so let's go back to the situation we had. So aggregate demand has decreased because we're in a recession. Price levels fell. Okay, you remember that Keynesian said that what we do in this situation is something. Instead of doing nothing like a classical economists want, we should do something to get aggregate demand to shift back to the right. They look at this as being a problem of spending. If aggregate demand is too low, that means the people are not spending enough. We need people to get them to spend more. All right, and the way we're going to do this is through one of the methods anyway, fiscal policy. All right, remember that fiscal policy is the idea that government uses taxing and spending to influence the economy. All right, so we can do expansionary fiscal policy. And in this, we will raise government spending and or we will lower taxes, one or the other, all right? Or we can do both. And then if the economy is doing too well, if aggregate demand has shifted to the right and we're getting inflation, we can do contractionary fiscal policy. That word is fiscal, by the way. Fiscal policy, all right, not physical. Okay, contractionary fiscal policy is the opposite. We will lower government spending and or raise taxes. Because if we do that, then we get less spending. If inflation is happening, it's typically demand pull. People are spending too much when you get them to spend less. All right. So with the expansionary fiscal policy, we're trying to get them to spend more in order to get the line to shift back to the right, the aggregate demand curve to shift back to the right. All right. But our problem is we can't just only get consumers to spend more or businesses to invest more. But what we can do is adjust the level of government spending. Okay. Because if aggregate demand is equal to C plus IG plus G plus XN, all right, consumption, business investment and capital, government spending, net exports. All right. So what we can adjust is this guy right here, the government spending. So we're going to get the government to spend more, right, on something. Now, one of the things you might recall is that when the government spends money on stuff, this is the whole multiplier effect. When we went through all of that, the multiplier effect is the idea that when spending increases in any one of these four categories, you will see an even bigger change in aggregate demand slash GDP. All right. And that's because when the money goes out there, it will create GDP initially, but then other people have that money. They'll spend a chunk of it on various things, and that's even more GDP, even more aggregate demand, more stuff being produced. So let's say the government is going to boost spending on, I don't know, defense. So it spends $1 billion on defense. The defense manufacturers have that $1 billion. So the initial $1 billion in spending was on government spending. Well, that was GDP. That was aggregate demand. Now the business has it. Let's say they pay it to all the workers. The workers now have $1 billion. They spend 900 million of it. All right. So let's say they spend 90% of it. Well, when they spend 900 million of it, that is going to be $900 million more in additional GDP that didn't exist before because they go out there and buy goods and services. Let's say the businesses have that money now. Well, the businesses will use, let's say, 90% of that in order to invest in capital, even more GDP. All right. So the government spent $1 billion in defense spending, but it created more than $1 billion in aggregate demand. It was even greater than what the initial amount was. So the whole idea of the multiplier effect is what is going to be that change in GDP? All right. So remember that we had these concepts here. You had MPC, which is the marginal propensity to consume, and you had MPS, which is the marginal propensity to save. The idea with MPC is asking, out of additional money that you get, how much of that money will you spend? Okay, and MPS is out of additional money that you get, how much of that will you save? All right. So the example I gave before is if I give you 10,000 extra dollars, how much of that will you spend? How much of that will you save? Okay. So if I give you 10,000 extra dollars and let's say that you save 2,000 of it, well, that means that your MPS in that case, if you save 2,000 of it, is going to be 0.2, 0.2 or 0.2. Okay. And that means your marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. All right. Because I gave you 10,000 additional dollars, you saved 2,000 of it, and you spent 8,000 of it. Okay, so you spent 80% of it and you saved 20% of it. We're going to represent that as decimals, 0.8 and 0.2. Remember that the MPC and the MPS have to equal 1. So once you know 1, you automatically know what the other one is. Okay, so in this case, we've got 0.8 and 0.2. Okay, and with these numbers, the MPC and the MPS, we can figure out the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. The spending multiplier is what we use when we see an increase in spending, whether it's going to be in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. If we say increase or decrease in spending, we use the spending multiplier. The equation for that is 1 over MPS. Okay. If we're talking about change in taxes, we will use the tax multiplier. And the tax multiplier, if we're assuming we're raising taxes, is negative MPC over MPS, right? In both cases, these multipliers will be positive. We're talking about adding money to the circular flow. We're going to create more spending. It's going to be negative if we're creating less spending within the economy. Okay, so what that means is if we're lowering spending somewhere in C plus IG or G or XN, if we're lowering spending, then this would be negative. Okay, if we're raising spending, this would be positive. Okay, here on the tax multiplier, if we're raising taxes, that means people don't have as much money to spend. So this would be negative. If we're lowering taxes, allowing people to keep more of their money, then this would be positive instead. Okay, now given this, we can figure out what the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier are for our little situation because we have the MPC and we have the MPS. Okay, so the spending multiplier, in this case, 1 over MPS is going to be equal to 1 over 0.2. All right, how many times does 0.2 go into 1? 5 times. Okay, negative MPC over MPS. We have negative 0.8 over 0.2. 0.2 goes into 0.8 4 times, so we get negative 4. All right. Now, where this comes into play is, let's say you got a problem. This is something like, we're going to raise spending, let's say capital investment by businesses increases by $1 million. What would be the overall change in GDP or overall change in aggregate demand? I usually say one or the other. All right. Well, if we're increasing spending, right, that's what capital investment is. That's IG out of C plus IG plus G plus XN. And that means we're going to use a spending multiplier. And we're increasing spending, so it's going to be a positive, spending multiplier down here. All right, it's going to be positive. Okay. So if we increase spending by $1 million, and we're talking about spending, we're going to use this guy here. So we would have 5, our multiplier, times the initial change in spending, which was $1 million. 5 times 1 million, $5 million. Okay, so capital investment increased by $1 million. You would see a maximum overall change in aggregate demand of $5 million. All right. Or in this situation, let's say the government raises taxes by $3 million. No. Let's say raise taxes by, $20 million. Okay, so if we're talking about taxes, we're going to use the tax multiplier, and we're raising taxes, so that means less spending in the economy. We're taking money out, so we're going to use a negative multiplier. So we would have negative 4. Oops, probably should go back to there. Negative 4, that's our tax multiplier, times the change in taxes, which was, what did I say, 20 million? So that would give you negative 80 million. Okay, negative $80 million would be our setup here, right? So overall aggregate demand would decrease by $80 million. Okay, now if we're going to deal with that graph, what does this mean for us then? Well, let's draw that graph again. Extend that guy. Okay, so this is our economy and when it's in equilibrium. All right, so long-term equilibrium, the economy is in its happy place. All right, we're not in a recession, we're not in an inflationary period. The economy is where it wants to be. Okay, so let's say the government is, let's also stipulate something else. So let's say that right here, all right, so $80 million. Let's say that when the economy is at full employment output is equivalent to $100 million. All right. So that would be the intersection point right here on the graph. All right. And the government is increasing taxes, which means less spending, less consumption, less investment, etc. All right. And what occurs then is that aggregate demand will decrease. It will be a shift to the left. So I'll use a different color here. So aggregate demand shifts this way. All right. Price levels were initially right here. And now we're here. And let's say that I ask you something like, oh, well, by how much did it decrease by, all right? Well, it would be Y2 there, the new level of output. Well, if the full employment output is 100 million, I said the increase in taxes had an overall effect of decreasing aggregate demand, GDP, by 80 million, but that'd be a lot. Yeah, that would mean that what we see right here at Y2 would be equivalent to $20 million, right? That we had decreased GDP by $20 million because of the increase in taxes, right? So the government increased taxes by $20 million, but we saw an increase, or excuse me, we saw a total decrease in aggregate demand of $80 million. All right. So you'd have what we call the recessionary gap. Right, the gap right there between full employment output and where we are right now, right? It's called a recessionary gap of $80 million. We're $80 million below what we're capable of doing. All right. And the reason I'm running through this is that I'm going to give you an assignment here, which is going to be about multipliers. And one of the things I want you to do is to draw this graph in various different ways. Right? I'm going to ask you to do different things with the graph. In fact, let me look back at this thing here. Let's see. Oh, so again, draw a graph, take a picture of it, and upload it to the Google Doc, or excuse me, the Google Form, which is not something that I've tried before. So this is exciting to see if it works out or not. All right. And you're going to try to see what happens, okay? Now, unfortunately, we're not in class. Otherwise, we would be practicing with aggregate supply and aggregate demand like crazy, and I'd be running through the kitchen sink, which is something else that I want to do, but don't really have time for at the moment, but we're going to get there, okay? But look through this here, right? A little presentation I just gave you, and think about what it is we talked about, and then give it a shot. If you've got questions, right? My recommendation is to write this down on a piece of paper, right? If you feel fully confident, you can go and submit everything there on the Google Doc. But otherwise, what you can do is write down your answers on a separate sheet of paper. And if you've got questions about any of this stuff, you can ask me. If you're in person, you can ask me in class. And if you're remote, you can send me a message in Canvas, or we can Zoom. Just give me a heads up or let me know that you want to Zoom, and we can do that and look over this stuff, all right? Because I want you to be able to get it down, right? Aggregate supply and aggregate demand, want it being fairly important, and we're just applying the multiplier concept to this, all right?